Good day, everyone. Welcome again to another CRiO webinar. This webinar is a little bit different in that it shares with you information about the next course that will be offered. And this course is entitled Life in the Universe. Now, our first course was the history of the Earth system, and building on what we learned about the Earth system, it makes sense that we take this knowledge and build upon it and extend what we know about the history of our planet and of life on our planet to the search for life elsewhere. This then brings us to the search for life in the universe. My name is Stephen Moisish, and I am a professor of geosciences at the Hungarian Academy of Sciences in Budapest, Hungary. I am also a solid-state physicist, chemist, geochemist, and I study the chemistry of planets and stars. So much of my work overlaps with that of the fields of astronomy, biology, and chemistry. So why don't I share with you something about me to help you understand the basis for what I know and what I'm sharing with you in a course such as The Search for Life in the Universe. Well, as I mentioned, I'm a professor of geology. I received my doctorate degree at the University of California at San Diego, and specifically at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography in 1997. Following that, I was a researcher known as a postdoctoral fellow at the University of California, Los Angeles. I was there for a little bit over 3 years. Then I was very fortunate to be appointed professor at the University of Colorado at Boulder in the United States. Now, I was a professor there from the year 2000 until the year 2021, when I changed my venue and my family and I moved to Europe, where I became a professor and institute director within the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. And my laboratory is at the Konkoly Observatory in Budapest. Now, the website for CRiO, the Collaborative for Research in Origins, is shown here. It's called CRiO.space. And in case you were wondering how to pronounce my name because of the unusual Central European spelling, it's typically Moisish. It could also be Mojžiš, depending on whether or not you know Hungarian or Slavic languages, or even German. So what about the kind of things that I study? I mentioned that a little bit, but specifically, I look at the geology and geochemistry and geophysical properties of the world's oldest rocks and meteorites. And all of this has the goal to try to understand what conditions gave rise to our habitable planet as opposed to the reported uninhabited planets of our solar system. I love questions, and I like to give answers, even in large classes like this one. So if you send me an email, I will try to answer your emails quickly. So that's about me. Why don't we talk about life in the universe? Well, what is life? You often hear this question in any discussion about life from a scientific sense. And frequently you hear that life must satisfy various behavioral characteristics. And one of these is that it reproduces, makes copies of itself, and that it uses DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, which is the information molecule of all life, to instruct this copying and also to instruct the functions of the cell, and also to pass information down from ancestor to descendant. So that is an important relationship. RNA, ribonucleic acid, which is, you might say, a somewhat structurally simpler form of DNA, is part of this equation. Then there's also the idea that life undergoes adaptation. Well, adaptation is a response of the information of life thanks to stimulus induced by the surroundings. So reproduction uses RNA and DNA, and adaptation is the consequence of the response by selection of this information reproduction. Now, that sounds a little bit convoluted, and the reason for that is we have no good definition of life. Life is so terribly complicated that you can add all sorts of corollaries to this definition that, well, life is self-contained, it's a chemical system that's in homeostasis, meaning it tries to maintain a steady state, which is not really true. That all life is cells, well, that's also a really good one. It satisfies what is known as the cellular theory of life, which is that everything that I've said so far requires encapsulation. That life eats and metabolizes, so it doesn't just sit there and do nothing, that it has a thermodynamical exchange with its environment, and that exchange is a chemical exchange. Well, I mentioned stimuli in my discussion of adaptation. Well, yeah, life responds informationally and in advanced life behaviorally to changes in stimulus, outside conditions. Life grows, life can die, and life is natural, so it's not artificial. It's not manufactured in a laboratory or a factory somewhere. Well, I mentioned the problem of life is that there is no generally accepted definition for it. Many definitions have been proposed, and these can be boiled down to 5 categories. One is this physiological definition for life, that life grows and it develops, and that it responds to the environment. Another may be viewed as metabolic, that life utilizes energy. So it is not thermodynamically isolated, and it doesn't violate any physical laws. Further, that life is ordered, which is kind of related to the second definition, which is in turn kind of related to the first definition. Next, life is biochemical, that it reproduces. Well, yes, and that's related to the next category of definition, which is genetic, that life participates evolutionarily in adaptation. So the underlying thesis for accepting a definition of life is that it participates in Darwinian evolution. Well, why don't we begin with the physiological? growth and development, and response to the environment. Yes, life grows, it performs function, it does things like eat, excrete, metabolize, move, grow, respond, reproduce, breathe. But interestingly, cars, fires, and thermometers do some of these things too. They move, they respond, they metabolize, they breathe, they even eat, excrete, and grow. Case of fire, for example. So that's not a particularly satisfying definition. How about the metabolic style of definition? Yes, that life uses energy to perform functions within its boundaries, the cell or community of cells, or like in our case, a body. And life exchanges material with its surroundings, and it doesn't alter its general properties by doing this exchange. So it remains an identity, and a human being remains a human being, even though it undergoes a growth stage and different developmental timing. Genes kick in at different times of life. But there are home appliances that do this too, and cars. And so it's incomplete, obviously. How about thermodynamics? You often hear that life is something that kind of goes uphill towards order against disorder. Well, yeah, components of life are contained within definite boundaries called cells. And life results in an increased order, or as what it's termed, a decrease in local entropy. But a book or even a folder like this one with information in it is locally ordered. I mean, I ordered it. So is that thermodynamically living? Obviously not. How about biochemical? This is where things certainly get tricky. Now, what about reproduction? This is the biochemical function of life. Life has a distinctive chemistry. It contains hereditary information, DNA, and that's defines the ancestor-descendant relationship. It's passed down. But viruses have distinctive chemistry, cold viruses, Ebola viruses, COVID, but they can't reproduce on their own. They need living cellular hosts to do that. By themselves, they do nothing. They can crystallize or fall apart. Is a virus life? If it requires life? Because by itself, it's more or less doing nothing. Mules, which are the products of horses and donkeys, or hinnies, the female version of a mule, cannot reproduce, but they're still alive. So this has a problem. There's also the genetic theory of life, that life participates in evolution by adaptation. So it's capable of changing with time by natural selection, so that genetic variation within a population permits adaptation because there's a plasticity in the genome such that natural selection will choose which organisms cannot favorably respond to changes in the environment, selective pressures. And therefore, the ones that do survive go on to reproduce and have a tendency to pass on those traits that help them survive to their offspring. But could machine life possibly do this? Can you imagine building a von Neumann machine that goes out and makes copies of itself by landing somewhere, building a factory, and then building the robots in that factory to build robots, copies of itself, then to send those out to other worlds, and then pretty much you would fill the galaxy quickly. Maybe. Now, this image is striking because somewhere in this image is a pair of Vietnamese mossy frogs. It shows just the remarkable, as I mentioned, plasticity of the genome and its ability to do things like adapt and increase its chances of survival. So evolution by natural selection, something we spent a lot of time discussing in our Introduction to the Earth System course, is really what we should term Darwinian evolution, reproduction and passing down of hereditary information, thanks to genetic variation, held by the individual, but defined by the population. So it's not survival of the fittest, really it's survival of the survivors. And that's what natural selection is. So what is life then? Reproduction and passing down of hereditary information, individual genetic variation, and survival of the survivors, giving rise to natural selection. So life then has the common characteristic that it is self-contained, chemical in its organization, and capable of undergoing Darwinian evolution. Darwinian evolution is key here because it means natural selection response. Self-contained is key here because it indicates order. And chemical allows for life chemistries, but excludes machine life, life from semiconductors or superconductors or solid state, purely electronic, even though technically chemistry is electronic. So think about it. Which of these to you is the most useful definition of life? Is it physiological? Would you say it's metabolic? Would you say it's thermodynamic and order? Biochemical and reproduction? Maybe it's a blend of all of those things. But here's the rub. If you were to ask a scientist, a learned person from just 1,000 years ago, what's in this glass? They would say, oh, water is in that glass. And water is one of the fundamental elements, along with earth, air, fire, and perhaps ether. Well, we know none of that is true. And instead, any regularly educated person would quickly point out that water is H2O. But think about that answer. It's a simple answer. Water is H2O, 2 hydrogens and an oxygen. All of the science, physics, and chemistry that went into making that answer is from centuries of toil. Now we have the answer, but to get there took a long time. It may be that for us to understand the context of the universe, of life in the universe, that we are as far away from a definition of life as anybody 1,000 years ago was as far away from what we understand is a definition of water.